What are elite networks? How do they work? It's simple, really. Think of them as informal social networks created between politicians in power and top executives of politically connected firms. The idea is that all benefit from being part of these social networks. Politicians get political rents in the forms of bribes or other favors, campaign donations, staying in power for a long period of time, or getting board positions after leaving office. Corporate executives secure rents for their firms, exclusive government contracts, barriers to entry, monopoly rights, subsidies, favorable legislation or regulation. As a consequence of this relationship, a corporate executive will receive a higher salary or bigger bonuses for making the deal. And this is where we get the impact on inequality. Wages of the top 1% or top 0.1% will be higher as an outcome of political connections. That's how it works. But two important things to add here. These networks are formed spontaneously. They typically involving geographical clusters. It's normal for powerful and highly connected individuals to hang out with each other. This is a standard finding of network theory. But this also makes all such networks highly topocratic, which means that it matters much more who you know than what you know. Think about it this way. Most people in any given country are poorly connected. They only know a limited group of people they interact with daily. But a small number of people on positions of corporate or political power are connected to a huge number of others. Just like influencers on social media, a select few of the most popular, like Taylor Swift or Beyoncé, Messi, Ronaldo, Elon Musk, they carry the highest number of connections and hence the greatest influence. And at the very top, all of them are connected to each other. The advantage elite network members get from this is they get access to privileged information on various opportunities, from job listings to stock tips. And the more topocratic a network is, the greater the inequality of opportunities and outcomes. Probably the best way to understand the extent of power that well-connected people have is to visualize some of these networks. I've handpicked the biggest and most interesting ones. Let's start with Bob Rubin, former US Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, and a true example of a super hub drawing connections between Wall Street and public office. His network is actually featured on the cover of my book. That's Rubin's network. Rubin was a controversial figure in the 90s and early 2000s, most remembered for his repealing of the Glass-Steagall Act and loosening of a bunch of derivatives regulations for banks. Before becoming Clinton's Treasury Secretary, he worked at Goldman Sachs for 26 years, and after his public office tenure, he moved to Citigroup, from which he controversially resigned in January 2009 at the height of the banking panic, while taking a bonus of $17 million in cash and $33 million in stock options. Remember, this was back when Citigroup was virtually insolvent, getting bailed out by the US government, by US taxpayers. Taleb famously cited this as the Bob Rubin trade. Heads I win, tails you lose. In other words, I take profits when times are good, and taxpayers cover the losses when times are bad. Before this episode, he was also caught in 2001 using his former friends in politics to convince the credit rating agencies not to downgrade Enron's corporate bond rating, because this would imply big losses for Citigroup, his employer at the time. So what's interesting about his network? Well, when becoming Treasury Secretary, he was ideally positioned as a connector between the new president's administration and the skeptical business communities. The Democrats got back in power after 12 years of Reaganomics, hence the skepticism of the business community. This was ideal ground for Rubin, a central node of a very big network. Let's see what his network looks like. You have the big red cluster. This is people mostly from banking and business, which he knew from companies like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup. And in the pink cluster, you have people like Bill Clinton or Peter Orszag, another person who's transitioning from public office to first Citigroup and later Lazard. In the orange cluster, you have the corporate CEOs he met through his various interactions. And the green clusters, you have people from the academia, like university deans or Larry Summers, who's one of those big connectors that you see down there. Also, there's a bunch of members from the Council of Foreign Relations. It's a nonpartisan think tank, which is breeding ground for the intersection of the very powerful people. From diplomacy, former presidents, secretaries of states, bankers, corporate executives, it's a proper elite network hangout. And Bob Rubin is at the center of it. Another great example is Tim Geithner, also former US Treasury Secretary and former New York Fed Chairman. When he was nominated as Obama's Treasury Secretary in January 2009, the stock price of every Wall Street firm that was connected to him shot up. Then a media story about his tax returns got out, casting doubt over the nomination, and these same companies saw their stock prices go down. And once again shot up as he was finally confirmed. There was an academic paper that uncovered this. It was called the Social Connections in a Crisis, because they clearly matter. So who is in his network? He successfully connects quite a few nodes. He's also on the Council of Foreign Relations, that's the blue cluster, and here you can find people like Condoleezza Rice or Madeleine Albright or Henry Kissinger. Then you have the private equity and banker networks. See, you can find CEOs of JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, etc. Geithner was actually the key link between Warburg Pincus, the green cluster, which is where he became CEO after his public service, and JP Morgan, the big bank, leading to a multi-billion-dollar investment from JP Morgan to Warburg. Obviously, they valued him very much for that. The network of foreign ministers is the second one. That's the red clusters. And you can find people like working in the World Bank, IMF senior officials, and finance ministers of foreign countries. And then you have the network of former or current public officials and high-ranking politicians, the pink cluster, featuring both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, or people like Jack Lev, Geithner's successor at the Treasury and later COO of Citigroup. But notice something else here, the smaller connections between the group. You have people like billionaire David Rubenstein, Obama's chief of staff Mona Sutpen, and Sharon Percy Rockefeller, the member of the Bilderberg Group, and also IMF director David Lipton. Quite a group. Geithner truly embodies the central node of an elite network. Next up is former Fed chairman during the 2008 crisis, Ben Bernanke. He has an even larger network, but that's just because the big blue clusters are all academics, because he became Fed chair after being a tenured professor in Princeton, and later a fellow at Brookings. So most of these people are from that connection, from that area. The pink connections are other central bankers and people from the World Bank and the IMF. Also visible here, another very interesting node is Janet Yellen, another academic turned policymaker and Bernanke's successor. But more interesting are his post-Fed connections from PINCO, the green cluster, and Citadel, the yellow cluster. From PINCO, we can see two interesting connections, Jean-Claude Trichet connecting PINCO to a lot of other central bankers, the former ECB chairman, and Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler connecting PINCO to the academic network. From Citadel, we see Ken Griffin, himself also a very connected node, not as central as Bernanke, but still very connected. What about outside politics? Okay, here are networks of Jamie Dimon, long-lasting CEO of JP Morgan, arguably the most powerful banker in the US, and right below him, George Soros, legendary investor. Now, despite their influence, their networks differ dramatically. Dimon is one of the most connected individuals in the entire database, while Soros has a much less dense network and is actually more international rather than US-focused. So you can find more people who are from the UK or European or even the Middle East, which could potentially explain the lack of density because we are looking mostly at US networks. Most of his connections are academics, notable economists, and only one central banker, Paul Volcker. There's very few politicians in there, although we do have both Clintons, Bill and Hillary, and New York mayor and billionaire Mike Bloomberg. Dimon, on the other hand, has all the same names as we've mentioned before, and he's also connected to several former Treasury secretaries, several central bank governors, and every major bank CEO. And that's not surprising, obviously, right? But it's so much more than finance. He has a strong connection with all of corporate America. People in there featuring long-lasting General Electric CEO Jack Welch, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer, Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Louis Vuitton's Bernard Arnault, Dell's Michael Dell, for example. He also has politicians. Barack Obama is in there, Condoleezza Rice, but also people like lawyer Robert Shapiro and Fox CEO James Murdoch, son of media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Obviously, Dimon is proving his word to JP Morgan. Finally, the only one who's comparable to Dimon in terms of size and centrality of connections is one of the most powerful people in corporate America, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock. The two of them share almost all the same connections I've just mentioned. Dimon is in there as well, by the way. He's the big green node. So we have banking and business, but also politics, to which Fink is connected via the Council of Foreign Relations, once again, and the World Economic Forum, and also the Robin Hood Foundation, a charity that he founded. I hope this showed you how topocratic networks form and exist as informal social networks, and how easy it is for the most connected nodes to disseminate privileged information, exchange favors, and even solicit advice in times of great uncertainty, like the 2008 crisis. Topocratic elite networks are a natural occurrence in every society. Powerful people will always form clusters between themselves. Again, that's normal. There isn't even anything wrong with that. In fact, it can often be beneficial for societies, like through philanthropy. The problem becomes when we allow elite network members to capture power and bend the rules in their favor. Then you get wealth concentration that's not an outcome of market innovation when everyone is better off. Instead, you get a non-market way of resource allocation benefiting the few of the most connected at the expense of the many. Buy the book, subscribe to my channel, and see how these outcomes can be prevented. A little hint, it's about reducing political power.